But the interesting one you have on your list is Claude Giroux, which everybody keeps going back to. And it's an interesting one because he's been sort of their guy with Philly for so long now. And I think, when you really look at teams over the past 10 years that have underachieved more so, it's got to be the Flyers, right? I mean, that team, I don't know if you can say they should have won a cup, but they were out of the mix way more than they ever should have been over the past 10 years.
Yeah, they've been very, especially like over the last maybe 5 to 6 years, very inconsistent from year to year. Where it's like there's years where they'll overachieve and like all, and you're like, oh yeah, they have some good players. Like this, watch out, this could be a team to keep an eye on. And then there's years where they'll go in like the next season and have some expectations and just be awful and like be out of it by this point, by like Christmas, New Year's, sometime in January. Like, oh man, what happened to the Flyers? Like, where did it all go wrong? And for a long time now, it's been defense and goaltending, and that's been a pretty consistent story for them. And they've tried different ways to address it, and it's never really worked. Carter Hart has still not really developed into the high end goalie that everyone thought he was going to be. It's not all on him. Like the defense in front of him still struggles. They went out and they got Ryan Ellis and Rasmus Ristolainen this past offseason.
Rasmus
And
Ristolainen.
and I like Ellis, and I think he's been fine when he's been healthy. He's also been banged up a bunch. But yeah, line and trade, that was, I don't know. I guess they thought, they could rescue him from Buffalo and still saw some of the potential that made him a high draft pick, but he hasn't been very good, and the defense as a whole has not been very good this year. They still have talented offensive players, and Claude Giroux is still producing. He's still having a good season. He still drives play at a high level. Like I think just about everything you'd want in a center man. The questions with him would be, he has had some tough postseasons the last few times that the Flyers have gone, along with plenty of other guys that you can throw under the bus. But I think he has 2 goals and 10 assists in his last like 28 playoff games. And that's like a dramatic reversal from early in his career when he always seemed to step up in the playoffs. And, I think he was like a point a game guy for years in the postseason. So, but a guy who's never won a cup, as you mentioned, has had teams that looked like they had a chance. Obviously, got to the one cup final in 2010 after they came back against the Bruins, but hasn't been back since then. So you assume he'd be pretty hungry to try to chase one at this point in his career, 34 years old, and that's where the discussion gets going about him potentially being traded because the Flyers are going absolutely nowhere this season. So he's on the final year of his contract. Yeah, he could go the route of, hey, he's been a Flyer his whole career. He's second in franchise history in points. He could just ride it out there and be a Flyer for life. But if he wants to chase that cup, then then he's got to be looking for a trade. And the Flyers, I assume, would love to be able to get something for him rather than risk having him walk in the offseason.
Good. Another inconsistent forward after the first line come the playoffs. That's always fun, right? But no, I do think that it's funny. He comes here. He's always been the main guy in Philly for a while now. On the bright side, if he came here, he wouldn't be facing the top another team's top matchups, top lines. So maybe he thrives in the secondary matchups and kind of puts up points there. Much better situation. I think the indication if they went out and got Claude Giroux, he's a guy who's not signed next year. He's signed through the end of this year. He's going to be a free agent. This would be a strictly short-term win-now move. This would indicate that this, I mean, we all know it, but this would probably be the final run at a cup. It would have to be because, again, if you go out and get a guy like Hurdle, he's younger. I think you have a little bit better chance of him signing long-term, especially because you'd hope that he'd be maybe a 1 or 2 C of the future. JT Miller's a guy who signed past this year, so that's another guy who you have for the future. Giroux is just this year. To me, Giroux shouldn't be the first, their primary target, but I do think that I think if they did go for him, it would signal, hey, this is probably the final year of this. Like, there's no way, unless they could re-sign Giroux if they could get Bergeron and Giroux to re-sign for like a year or two each. But again, hard to tell if that's the case either. So Giroux, if they went for Giroux, it would feel like we're putting all our chips to the middle of the table with this one. But I don't know. I mean, what would it take for that?
Yeah, I don't know. I feel like because Giroux would probably be one of the better rentals, again, maybe not as appealing as a Hurdle who's younger and, probably a more dynamic offensive player at this point, but I still think you're probably giving up at least one premium asset even to get Giroux. So I don't know if that's this year's first round pick. I found the Bruins. I don't think I'm entertaining Lysell or Swayman, but maybe it's Mason Lohrei is the centerpiece. A player whose value is rising. Evan, as you know, is having a very good freshman year at Ohio State. As an overage player, which like should be noted, but nonetheless is having a very good season.
He's like
Uh,
he's like Adam Sandler in kindergarten.
yeah, right. Um,
No, he's doing great. He's having a great year. We don't mean to like make light of it.
yeah,
It's funny though.
like
I
you
mentioned
would
this
be
to Ty
concerned.
last. I mentioned this to Ty last week. There was a great highlight going around of this spinorama pass that Mason Lowride
Yeah,
made, and everyone was like, "Whoa, my god, that's incredible!" And I was like, "It's great, it's great." But it came against LIU. Like, yeah, you got to have a little sense of the awareness there for those moments. But it was great. It was great. And I personally, I would not look to trade Lowry, but that's who knows.
yeah, but it always comes back to like, yeah, to get a good piece, to get a number two center, you're gonna have to give something up. Like that player's
Yeah.
not gonna come cheap. You got Taylor Hall for super cheap, for only a second round pick and Anders Bjork, but that was because he had a no trade clause and he basically forced his way to Boston. He, more or less told them like trade me to the Bruins. So
Yeah.
unless you can find another guy like that, like I don't know, maybe someone can get a hold of Claude Giroux and be like, "Hey, go tell the Flyers you're only going to Boston." Then great, but short of that, like you're not going to be able to get a top six impact guy, or if we're talking about defense, a top four defenseman for a second round pick and a bottom six forward or a middle tier prospect. Like that's not going to happen. So at some point, like you've got to be able to give up something, and it might have to end up being a Mason Lohrei.
You mentioned Lowry, and I wouldn't want to trade him just because I do think that that's one area where you're not deep. Is you're looking for that top four left shot defenseman of the future, and he seems like at least he's on the track to do that. Speaking of defensemen, though, I mean, do you think that a guy like Vakanainen, with his rising stock this year in the NHL, you think that could be something where maybe he's not the centerpiece, but he prevents you having to give up a low ride? Like instead, you might give up, the package you'd give up plus Vakanainen, and that saves you low ride. That could maybe even save you a first.
It could. I mean, Vakanainen has certainly helped his value for sure, and helped the Bruins' value. I guess the question there is are you doing anything else to address your defense? Because if you're saying we're going to go after number two center, like if that ends up being your priority and that's the move that you make, chances are you're probably not also getting a top four defenseman. Like you might get a depth defenseman, some sort of veteran. Uh, but then you would need to decide, like, if you're debating giving up Vakanainen, can he help us win this year? Because over the last few weeks, he's in terms of ice time, he's basically been their number two defenseman. Like only McAvoy has been playing more minutes, and I think Vakanainen has done pretty well. Like I think he's playing pretty good hockey for the most part. So I don't think it's totally out of the question that this is a guy who ends up winning a job for you this year and becomes a regular for you by the time the playoffs get here. So that would be tough, but again, like got to give something up. So if he's valued by other teams and other teams see what he's doing, and maybe they look back at their notes from the 27 draft and like, oh yeah, this is a play we really liked. Yeah, maybe he appeals enough to another team that he can be a key piece to a major trade. I certainly wouldn't give him up as like a throw in or anything like that. Like,
Oh
you know,
no.
I would trade him if someone values him highly. Um, but other than that, like I would be very tempted to try to keep him just because I think there's a chance that he's going to help them this season.
It's not like in Moneyball where Billy Bean's like, "Oh, I'm gonna throw in this guy. I'll throw in. I'll pay for your vending machine for the next year. I'll give you Urho back in 9." I don't think it's anything like that. But yeah, I mean, if you can center a trade for a second line center like Giroux or Hurdle or someone, if you can centerpiece that around like Vakanainen, I don't hate that. I know the other thing
Yeah.
is they have to address depth on D because as you said, you're not getting both. You have to pick between a 2C and a top four defenseman. I also think it's tough because there's not a lot of other top four defensemen on the market. I think that it seems like there's more centermen than there is defensemen, at least. So I don't know. I don't
Yeah,
think
it kind of feels like
helps.
on defense, it's like you're gonna have to wait to see maybe which Western Conference teams fall out of it. Because there's a few guys like on some of those bubble teams, like maybe a Hampus Lindholm in Anaheim. But if Anaheim's hanging around and they're in the playoff race, then they're not trading Hampus Lindholm. So,
Yeah.
you know, we might get a chance to see one of the guys. Tuesday night, there's already been some rumors about Seattle possibly trading Mark Giordano. Now, I think his first preference would be to go back to Calgary. So you'd have to compete with that.
Right back. That'd be
Yeah, which
something,
would be
wouldn't
pretty
it?
it would be pretty crazy. But I think, that they parted on good terms. Like it's not like it was like, we gotta just, dump Giordano, like we're done with this guy. See ya, go to Seattle. I think everyone kind of understood like why he was the one who had to get exposed so they could protect other younger defensemen. Um, so they might just do that. But if he's available to a wider market and he's open to going elsewhere, then that's one player who would be available in the sense that like Seattle's out of it. It doesn't look like they have much of a chance of making any sort of run. So, but to your point, there aren't a whole lot of those guys right now on teams that are really completely out of it.
Yeah, there's no one that's clear, like, oh, that guy's going to be available. Like, I think you're going to have bidding wars for guys like Hurdle or JT Miller. That's like the big one. So I don't know. I mean, it's going to be interesting to see. Again, we're still just under 2 months away from the deadline. Like, it feels like it's way closer than it actually is because it normally is much closer. But, anyways, Bruins got a lot to do there. I mean, again, I think it's going to come down to either you pick a 2C and a depth defenseman, or you pick a top 4D, which I think is going to be a little harder to do, and maybe a depth forward. I don't know.
Yeah, like
I don't know.
maybe like a DeBrusque replacement if you do end
Yes.
up trading him, which might not even happen at this point. So
Yeah, it feels like he's just going to be around here forever. I think every time he gets like Oreos over the glass, he's like, maybe I like it here. Maybe I don't need to. You don't need to trade me if you don't want to.